An attempt is being made by way of secret meetings, secret documents, secret agreements, and pressure on the clubs to destroy the traditional structures of European football. These were the words of UEFA President Lennart Johansen in 1998. What in the world had gotten him so riled up? Well, it was a clandestine and explosive plan to revolutionise European football and oust UEFA from their seat of power, dominance and control. The earth-shattering scheme was codenamed Operation Gandalf, and it put the fear of Mordor and Sauron into some of football's most powerful people, leading to an unprecedented transformation of European football, the effects of which are felt to this very day. That such a situation was allowed to develop was largely the fault of UEFA themselves. Repeated calls by top clubs to revamp their competitions were consistently ignored by European football's governing body. Teams like Manchester United and Bayern Munich, who finished second in their respective leagues the season prior, were fed up with tiring, unglamorous, and what they saw as essentially pointless qualifying rounds with so-called minnows from Eastern Europe. For the 98-99 season, United beat LKS Lodz of Poland 2-0 on aggregate in the second qualifying round to get into the Champions League group stages. Bayern thumped Yugoslavians FK Obilic 5-1. Additionally, some of the competition's most historically successful clubs were frustrated that their recent domestic performances could stop them from qualifying. AC Milan, for example, found it distasteful that something so paltry as finishing 10th in the Serie A should prevent them from contesting a cup they had won 5 times. Also, high-profile glamour ties between giants of the game were all too infrequent. And on top of that, participating clubs had almost no say in how the Champions League was run. Ultimately though, money was the principal gripe. UEFA's divvying up of the yearly Champions League bounty was seen as unfair. In the 97-98 season, the Champions League generated around £152 million in revenue. Of that, just £83.6 million, or 55%, was distributed to participating clubs. £24 million went to Team Marketing, a Swiss firm that controlled commercial and TV rights, and nearly £30 million went straight to UEFA itself for administration. Real Madrid, who won the whole competition that year, received just £8.4 million. The top clubs wanted a huge increase in their slice of the pie. The television boom of the 90s had made them realise that it was the teams that were the biggest draw, not UEFA. As Adriano Galliani, AC Milan director, said, "Who lures fans and which players are loved? The winners, of course, and class players. Those who know how to win cost incredible amounts of money, which is why top-level teams need to make top-drawer cash to stay competitive." And so, in this environment of frustration and mistrust, outside actors saw their opening and they made their move. The leader of the revolution was a man named Rodolfo Hecht. A football fanatic and lifelong AC Milan supporter, Hecht began his career in finance, working for Merrill Lynch, before pivoting into media. In Italy, he pioneered the Telecalcio scheme, the first pay-per-view football deal in Europe. He also ran sporting events for Telepiù 2 and served as chairman of Fininvest, a holding company of the media empire owned by none other than Silvio Berlusconi. But in '98, Hecht was at the helm of a Milan-based company called Media Partners, and he had an idea that would shake European football to its core. Media Partners were involved in a wide range of sports and were world leaders in the management of international television rights for major ski events, accounting for more than 50% of their earnings. They also advised the Serie A on TV rights for matches, but behind the scenes, they'd been quietly working on something much bigger, something codenamed Operation Gandalf. In July '98, the Daily Telegraph blew the lid off the story, reporting that Europe's top clubs, including Manchester United, had attended a secret meeting in London to discuss a breakaway league. Media Partners had been working on the concept for 5 years. They'd poured over 40,000 hours of legal work into it. A leaked letter signalled their intentions. Currently, the European football market is governed by a monopolistic competition organiser, UEFA, whose exploitation of European club games could be seen as suboptimal. This results in deficient and unpredictable revenue streams for the clubs from these competitions. Furthermore, the clubs have very little influence on how these competitions are governed and run. Our client intends to set up a group of companies to run alternative football competitions. The proposal was officially named the European Football League. It aimed to completely replace the Champions League and UEFA Cup with 2 new midweek competitions. In response to criticisms from various sources, the EFL took several different guidelines prizes before settling on its final form. The biggest prize was to be the European Super League, a direct Champions League replacement. The top tier would consist of 18 founding members, chosen based on performance over the 10 previous years. These clubs would be guaranteed participation for at least 3 seasons, after which their place would be reviewed. They alone would decide how the competition was run. Below them, a second tier would be populated based on yearly domestic performance. The format featured a group stage comprising 2 sets of 18, followed by a knockout round for the top 9 teams from each group. To accompany it, media partners proposed a second competition, the Pro Cup, a knockout tournament to replace the UEFA Cup. It would feature 96 clubs. Initially, clubs from Eastern Europe and other smaller nations were to be excluded, but following backlash, media partners reversed course and pledged to include all 51 UEFA member nations in the Pro Cup. Now, the EFL plan was not short on funding. The deal was underwritten by JP Morgan for a 6-year period. Hecht promised the new format would generate £1.25 billion per season. 80% of that revenue would go to participating clubs, a sharp contrast to the 55% offered by UEFA. On top of that, £50 million a year would be dedicated to grassroots and amateur football, dwarfing UEFA's measly £500,000. The revenue would be mainly generated by selling the matches to fans on pay-per-view. Hecht was confident. There are elements to our competition that UEFA cannot match. The first is ownership, control and transparency. Our concept would give the clubs 100% direction of the competition, nor at short notice could UEFA match the amounts of money, the security of our format, or the legal framework that safeguards the European League. In other words, media partners wasn't just offering clubs more money, they were offering power, and the big clubs were listening. The immediate response from UEFA and FIFA was one of panic and threats. If a league were set up in defiance of UEFA, it would lead to the suspension of the clubs concerned and their players. Any players would be banned from playing any kind of professional football, including international matches, until the suspension were lifted. That's the barrier they have to cross, warned FIFA Communications Director Keith Cooper. UEFA's General Secretary Gerard Ainier embarked on a whistle-stop tour of Europe, meeting with various clubs, pressuring them to sign a document disavowing Operation Gandalf. The clubs refused. Still, Ainier attempted diplomacy. UEFA does not want to, indeed cannot, ignore the worries of the clubs. We are engaged in informing them of our own plans while listening to their suggestions. Many clubs hit out at the guaranteed participation aspect of the proposed Super League. We are only interested in merit. Otherwise, media partners can shove off, said Chelsea chairman Ken Bates. It is clear from my discussion with clubs that any competition which does not have merit as the criterion for entry is unacceptable, echoed the Premier League's chief exec Peter Lever. While media partners were willing to tweak certain elements, the idea of 18 founding members with automatic entry for 3 years was non-negotiable. Their financial backing from JP Morgan relied entirely on those clubs being guaranteed participants. And speaking of finances, many were deeply skeptical of the figures media partners were throwing around. Many of the clubs attracted by media partners must realise they are backing a risky venture. They want guarantees of income for 6 years. Tell me, which company in the world can guarantee its income for 6 years? Can Microsoft? Scoffed Guido Tognoni, head of UEFA's national teams department. The media partners' proposal has been given a credibility that I don't think should be attributed to it. I don't understand some of the figures media partners have put about. It's beyond belief to suggest that an organisation created only for profit is going to pour millions and millions of pounds into grassroots football. That's pretty desperate stuff. It's a bizarre concept that anybody can come along and run their own competition. That leads to anarchy, added FA chairman Keith Wiseman. Rodolfo Hecht wasn't having it. The fact that JP Morgan have put their name to a figure should be enough. Does anyone with any common sense think they would do that without ripping it apart in every detail and examining it thoroughly? It's a joke that we should be doubted. We shared our financial model with the clubs involved, and we convinced JP Morgan of the soundness of our project. And what of the fans? Well, a controversial Mori poll suggested that they were unanimously in favour of the Super League. Of the 1,061 fans interviewed in 159 sampling points across Britain, 70% said that replacing the current UEFA club competitions with a midweek EFL would be a good thing. 15 to 24-year-olds responded the most positively. 80% called it a good idea, and 74% were in favour of more frequent matches between Europe's top clubs. However, it later came out that the Mori poll was flawed, and the questions were designed in such a way to skew the answers towards supporting the Super League. Real fan groups weren't convinced. Fan power will be decisive. If our views are ignored, we'll have to consider other options. If the language of finance is the only one they'll listen to, we'll have to respond in kind. Boycott of matches, boycotts of the sponsors is possible, said Ivan Todd of the campaign against the European Super League. Still, through all the public back and forth, one thing became clear. Media partners had leverage, and UEFA were beginning to feel it. The likeliest scenario is media partners won't get what they want, but that pressure will be brought to bear on UEFA to change, said a source close to Manchester United. And indeed, the pressure was so heavy that they caved. As one insider put it, UEFA had been forced to come down from the Swiss mountains and talk to the clubs, and no longer act like the distant, unapproachable body they used to. A special task force, including some of Europe's top clubs, was set up to advise UEFA on the restructuring of their club competitions. Operation Gandalf had chucked a grenade into the system. On October 3rd, after over 3 hours of tense negotiations, the newly formed European Football 2000 Task Force emerged with 2 draft concepts for a revamped Champions League. Neither of them impressed Real Madrid. The money is nothing like as good as that on offer with media partners, said Lorenzo Sanz. 4 days later, UEFA's executive committee agreed to expand the Champions League to 32 teams. We have found a very good balance between sporting, political and commercial interests. What we are presenting now is a big step forward to ensure a prosperous future of European football under the leadership of UEFA, said Lennart Johansen. Across Europe, the tide was turning. Clubs and nations were denouncing the media partner scheme. On October 17th, at a summit of Central and Eastern European football associations, the EFL was roundly rejected. There was total support for the position of UEFA. The Super League would see the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, exclaimed Attila Kovacs, president of the Hungarian Football Federation. The Super League is a cancer. This is about the difference between football the sport and football the industry, agreed Milan Milanic, the Yugoslav Football Federation president. And then, on October 24th, came the final blow. At a historic summit in Geneva, 12 of Europe's biggest clubs officially rejected the breakaway Super League and pledged their allegiance to UEFA. The 12 clubs present in Geneva have affirmed their wish to work with UEFA. We must make concessions, but we want to remain within the overall European Confederation. UEFA has come up with practical proposals, and I think we can say the meeting has historical importance. Media partners' plans are now lying dormant. They are sleeping, said Galliani. Finally, Madrid had heard some numbers they were happy about. UEFA understands perfectly our concerns and have presented a very interesting project of long-term collaboration with the clubs. UEFA has amazed us with their proposals. We are very impressed with the amount of work they have done, beamed Lorenzo Sanz. So, what exactly were these proposals? What had UEFA cooked up that had bowled over Real Madrid, the hardest to please institution throughout the situation? What UEFA unveiled was the biggest overhaul of European club competitions since they began in the 1950s. The new system guaranteed 16 Champions League group stage spots. The winners and runners-up from Italy, Germany, Spain, France, England and the Netherlands were given direct entry to the group stage, as were champions from Norway, Portugal, Greece and the Czech Republic. Clubs finishing 3rd and 4th in Italy, Germany and Spain, along with 3rd place from France, England and the Netherlands, runners-up from Portugal, Greece and the Czech Republic, and the champions of Austria, Russia, Croatia, Turkey, Denmark and Switzerland would all enter at the 3rd qualifying round. For other nations, the pathway became significantly harder. The Scottish champions would have to navigate 2 separate qualifying rounds just to reach the group phase. The champions of Ireland faced 6 games before they could even share a pitch with Europe's elite. The first group stage would consist of 8 groups of 4, the winners and runners-up of which would be funneled into the second group stage, before the top 2 of that progressed to the knockout round. This meant that the winners of the newly expanded Champions League in 2000, Real Madrid, had to play 17 matches before lifting the trophy, a significant increase from the 11 they negotiated when they won it in 1998. UEFA also announced that the Cup Winners' Cup would be discontinued and merged into a revamped UEFA Cup. UEFA projected that the revamped Champions League would bring in £365 million per season, a major increase in revenue. Of that total, roughly £275 million, about 70 25% would go to participating clubs, but £114 million of that would be reserved for the clubs from the top 5 leagues, justified by their greater TV appeal and market value. This was based on UEFA's calculations that 83% of the Champions League revenue would be generated by teams from 5 nations. The remaining £160 million would be distributed based on performance. £690,000 for simply appearing in a match, £230,000 as a basic match fee, an additional £230k for the winners, and £115,000 for draws. You get a bonus of £1.9 million for reaching the quarterfinals, and £2.3 million for reaching the semis. £3.7 million would go to the runners-up, and £4.7 million for the tournament winners. At the other end of the spectrum, teams eliminated in the first 2 qualifying rounds received just £37,000, a token amount. To put the new disparity in perspective, if Manchester United went all the way and lifted the trophy, they stood to make around £35 million from UEFA. If Celtic or Rangers somehow achieved the same feat, their maximum payout would be just £12 million. As one UEFA source put it, without much subtlety, in the past UEFA took from the rich countries and clubs and gave to the poorer ones. We are now going to ditch that sort of brutal socialism and go for a more free market approach. Media partners and their audacious Operation Gandalf may have failed to launch a breakaway league and oust UEFA's competitions, but it still managed to change European football forever. By pushing UEFA to the brink, media partners and the rebel clubs forced a complete restructuring of Europe's top competitions. The expanded Champions League, the prioritisation of TV revenue, the consolidation of power among the big 5 leagues, all of it was a direct response to the threat of a breakaway, and it did not end there. This was also the beginning of the end for European football on terrestrial TV. To compete with the money on offer from media partners, UEFA embraced satellite broadcasters and pay-per-view models. Football became less accessible. The universal experience of the past was replaced by a premium product hidden behind a steep paywall. The Champions League expansion also sparked fears for player welfare, which continued to this day. As the chief exec of the PFA, Gordon Taylor, said after the new format had been introduced, "We're almost accepting that it's a 3-match a week, 40-week a season game, but you're not talking about machines. We're only into October, and I bet there's hardly a top player who's not been injured already this season. There are going to be a lot of career expectations shortened because of injury. We're going to end up with a load of crocs." In addition, many supporters quickly found they became numb to the endless treadmill of European games. This new format has made the Champions League totally remote. I am not as interested in it anymore. It was relatively easy to keep up interest over one night, but not 3. I don't make an effort now. A lot of supporters think like this, said Sheila Spears of the Football Supporters Association. The situation also led to the creation of the G14, a conglomerate of Europe's top clubs who vowed to keep an eye on and pressure UEFA. One of their first actions was to condemn the decision to expel Fiorentina from the UEFA Cup because of crowd trouble. The G14 lasted for years until it merged with the European Club Forum in 2002, which eventually led to the creation of the ECA in 2007. There were even reports that media partners began legal proceedings against UEFA for abuse of monopoly, a sign of just how deep and tangled this power struggle really was. Ultimately though, UEFA stayed in charge, but the most powerful clubs got what they really wanted: more money, more access, more control, and the rest, they were left to fight over scraps. The irony is, the very things critics feared about Operation Gandalf, exclusivity, inequality, and commercial dominance, were not defeated. They were simply absorbed. If you enjoyed this video about a failed breakaway league, then I think you'll also like this in-depth look at the fabled Atlantic League.